Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Lemick. I'm the founder and CEO of the Wounded Workforce, and I am so grateful to have an amazing group assembled today to talk about something really important, really challenging, especially as we're approaching the holiday season: grief at work. So, want to go ahead and kick off with an introduction of our panelist. Geraldine, would you mind kicking us off and introducing yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, no problem. Hi, everyone. I'm Geraldine Roberts. I'm a leadership development practitioner, really focusing on the intersection of trauma and leadership, as well as coaching and developing leaders to use self discovery as a way of strengthening their leadership. And grief is definitely a part of that. So, super excited and honored to be here.
Oh, so great to have you, Geraldine. Morgan.
Hi, I'm Morgan. I am the CEO of Peak HR. A little about me is that I have been in probably every different area of HR except for payroll and benefits. And I would say I have my master's in dispute resolution and conflict management and my bachelor's in psychology. So that pairs very well with the person, the conflict, and the topic at hand.
Amazing. So great to have you, Morgan. I'm thrilled to finally have you join us on a panel. I'm such a huge fan of yours.
Huge fan of yours too, so.
Jessica, great to have you back.
Yes, great to be back. So thanks everyone for joining. My name is Jessica Donahue, and I am a fractional head of people. So I spent about 10 years in different in-house HR roles and then pivoted into self-employment and fractional HR about 4.5 years ago. So happy to be here and learn from this group and also offer some of my thoughts as well.
Amazing. Alex, wrap us up. Great to have you, friend.
Thank you. Great to be here. And thanks for having me back. Alex Seiler. My background is as a in-house chief people officer who's turned fractional as well, and founder of my own business, Alex Seiler LLC. And I'm also a startup advisor, and have done many parts of the HR function similar to Morgan. This topic touches me on a personal level, which is then impacted how I look at it from a work perspective as well. So I'm very happy to be surrounded with such a great group of people and people that I know and consider a safe space as well. So I'm looking forward to the dialogue.
Amazing. So great to have you. So grateful to have your voice as part of this. So let's dive in and let's talk about what we're going to be chatting about today. Really, we're going to be exploring the critical and often overlooked topic of how grief impacts employees and organizations, and also discuss some strategies for creating more supportive work environments. As most of us know, grief is a universal human experience and it doesn't stop at the office door. Whether it's the loss of a loved one, a colleague, or even significant life changes, grief can profoundly affect an individual's well-being and job performance. Yet so many workplaces still struggle to address grief openly and compassionately. So our goal here today is to have some conversation and talk about how we can get better at doing just that. So I'd love to kick off with a question for each of you. Why is this topic, the topic of grief at work, important to you?
I can kick us off.
Perfect.
So I'm kind of coming at this from two angles, as always. I feel like one angle, of course, is that I support teams at my clients, and so I've certainly helped a number of employees on different teams who are dealing with grief, kind of cope with that and work through that at the workplace. But it's also something I experience personally, right? I think in some way we're all grieving all the time, right? Like I'm grieving what happened yesterday. I'm grieving the past. I'm grieving my history. I got a very strong introduction to grief, I guess you could say, when I lost my partner of 4 years in college, actually, to cancer. And so that was a very kind of formidable time for me. And some of the experiences that I had personally dealing with my grief and trying to work and go to school taught me a lot about maybe what not to do. So that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, I'll step in right after Jessica. I think that as HR people, yes, of course, we're always thinking about, our people, our teams, how can we get their engagement? And I think Bifold, I started thinking about this a lot differently ever since last year. I had lost a few people back to back. And it really started making me think about like the compliance, the policies, and also like where do we get 5 days from? Like some of the basics that we've all kind of continued with, it made me start challenging why is it precedent? Like why did this happen? And also how did we get to the certain levels of whether it's your mom or stepmom or grandparent, like when we know that families look vastly different for different people. So it just made me really think about it a lot more. Personally, because I was faced with it.
Yeah, I can jump in after that too. Thank you both for sharing such vulnerable things about yourself and your experience. And so for me, this is important also for a couple of reasons. One, I would say I'm a very people-centered leader who really cares about well-being and the care of individuals. And so this, just like you said, Stephanie, is a very universal human emotion, right? And it's not talked about, but it's so common. And so that juxtaposition of the two really makes it important to me. How can we as leaders normalize this emotion, this feeling that, Jessica, I think you said, like, everybody is grieving something all the time, but nobody's talking about it. And so I just feel honored to be able to be a part of this conversation to kind of unearth and normalize and uncover some of the truths about grief at work. And then on a personal note, I've just experienced a lot of loss in many different ways. In 2019, my younger brother, who was 23, was murdered. And I had to go back to work not long after. And so, and not only that, I was like developing leaders at a huge corporation. So just navigating that in itself was really hard, and how sudden that happened. And then on the other hand, last year, my husband's brother-in-law, who I became really close to, passed of stiff person syndrome. And so, which that grief hit me differently because now you're experiencing and watching someone suffer over a long period of time. And so just realizing how the breadth and the depth of grief, and we don't leave that at home. We bring it with us, right? And so that is why this is super important for me, and glad to be here to be a voice to talk about such an important topic.
I guess it's my turn. So I just want to first say I +1 to everything that everyone has said as far as their, the reasons. And I just, I'm glad I'm not the only one that's about to share a vulnerable story as well. But similar to others, it's very deeply personal for me. I lost my mother a year ago today. And she had battled many forms of cancer for about 12 years, beaten a few, and then her current form of cancer metastasized, and we had a timeline. So I dealt with quite a bit of anticipatory grief in particular last year. And that fundamentally shifted the way that I look at grief. I think that as I think it was already mentioned, death touches every one of us. It really is universal. And I think by normalizing these conversations, we're not just supporting our colleagues through loss, we're acknowledging we have a shared humanity, and we're building more compassionate organizations. And so I don't think it's just about good leadership. I think it's about human connection. So where I'd love to get to is where we create spaces where grief isn't hidden behind closed doors or buried under the "I'm fine," which I've done as I went through grief in the workplace. But we make room for it, and we make room for healing as well.
Thank you all so much. Challenging and beautiful examples of how we all, how all of these different stories, how grief shows up for each of us in a different way. And of course, immediately I'm going off my list of questions based on something that came up. But, Morgan said it. How did we get to 5 days? How did we get to this place where, when we're experiencing loss, we are very, hopefully not as many organizations anymore, but many organizations still are. Hey, bring me a little prayer card, or bring me the funeral pamphlet, and that can be the reason you get 3 days off. Obviously, that is kind of the archaic approach to death and grief in the workplace. What does kind of the ideal state of supporting grief at work, supporting loss at work look like to you? And this is a huge question. Let me just lob off a big old baseball right at first. So anyone who wants to jump in with ideas is welcome to.
I will say I don't have a specific answer, but something that I heard Alex bring up is something I've been thinking about a lot. My granny, she actually passed from Alzheimer's, and that's a long process. And you see somebody change throughout that, and even hearing you talk about cystic fibrosis syndrome, like seeing that I was grieving her. This is somebody that I'm literally losing in front of my eyes. Is she gone right now? No, not physically. She's still here, and I think that's something we talk about grief as they basically, died at that moment. In some of these illnesses, you are grieving long before that. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that's a portion that we just really don't talk. When we talk about bereavement, it just goes right after they have passed. And that's why we have the funeral announcements. That's why people are asking for obituaries. But what about that moment in between where this person no longer recognizes you or can't say their name, or this is your parent, your family member, whatever the case may be, your friend? What about that grief? That's some really strong grief. And I know you definitely had a specific question, but I think that's also where I get really turned around, because for me, that's when I was probably grieving the most. I had accepted it by the time that, her death came. And honestly, she was in pain, there were things going on. So that was actually a better moment for me, but it was the in-between times where there was nothing that lack of support, lack of things that you have access to, because this person is still living. And I think that's the thing that I think about of how do we look at this in a multifaceted way? It is not just one and done. It's not in this just specific space. Grief, like Jessica was saying, and how you started, we grieve things all the time, and I think that's the part that I think HR, we can really start changing the wheel of being accepting and being there a lot earlier, and understanding it is not the final moment. Sometimes it's moments way before then.
Yeah. That's beautifully stated. And also thinking about, Alex, what you said earlier around human connection, I think that's really the core of it. How can we co-create what this looks like for you, and know that one size doesn't always fit all, because we have to create space too for the other ways that grief shows up, right? It could be a loss of a person, but it also could be a loss of a relationship, a loss of a dream that you have to let go of, a loss of where you thought your life might be that no longer is, a loss of financially. There's so many ways that grief shows up. And so if there's a way to create, particularly for leaders, to really create that relationship with our team members, that we're in communication, where we're fostering a environment where it feels safe to share, where my team member can say, hey, I'm really struggling. And I don't say, well, you have 2 days to grieve that. We don't get to say that. And so then as they are continuing their work, how can we work together to make sure that you have the space that you need to heal, but also that I am tailoring what this work looks like to what you need? Because for some people, work is a healthy distraction and they need it. For some people, they don't. But I won't know that unless I invest in a relationship with you. And so human connection, I think you're spot on with that is the core of.
Yeah, and I would just add on to it is I just realized how much I didn't know or understand about grief until I went through it, as I'm sure others, may have felt as well. It's you can be empathetic, but until you go through it, it takes on a life of its own that you just don't really understand. And each person's situation is incredibly unique. And that's why we always talk about how this isn't linear. And you're not going to come back after 5 days of, bereavement leave and just all of a sudden be super productive, right? And if people ask one, oh, are you, is this person a performance issue now? We've seen their work decline. No, they're actually going through something, and they need time to kind of get through that, and there needs to be some grace around that. And kind of going back to your question a little bit, like Stephanie, like I think we need to move away from policies are a part of what we need to be doing, but I think we need more frameworks. And I think as part of that is we need more flexible policies, but we need to be doing, grief counseling. We need to be providing manager training. We need to be providing peer support groups or grief groups. Like we need to be providing mental health days that don't account against your PTO. Like we need to be doing different things because some of these things will resonate with people and some won't. But that's why having some sort of framework that doesn't follow some standardized timeline, I think is so important.
And flexibility. I think just adding in the flexibility, I constantly just keep thinking about what is family? Family is different for everybody. And these policies, a lot of times, as somebody who is heavily in compliance, which is me, but like a lot of policies are extremely stringent on this. And I think that was my first time really jumping in and realizing of like, oh, like I knew this theoretically. Like I think we all know these things. But once again, you said it, Alex, of like when you're living this, it feels vastly different. Like it's very different. And it's like, whoa, why would anybody say that? Like, why would we say that? I think the other portion too of even talking about how we show up for each other and humanizing, it reminds me a lot of, sometimes when somebody hears that somebody has passed, they completely just stop talking to that person or about that person's family member, whatever. And like, sometimes for me, it was the complete opposite. I wanted to keep their memory alive. I wanted to talk about them in a way because it felt healthy for me. It felt like I was keeping them alive in a different type of way that meant something to me. But I think we have so much of almost anxiety and like, how do I address this? Like, I'm not sure how they want to talk about it because we can't even invite the conversation, something that we've all dealt with. At least we still can't add that human component to there to even ask, like, what does grieving look like for you? Because like you said, even before, some people really love to work. I dove into work. Like that was just exactly what I did. And then at a certain point, I became very unproductive, And so I stepped back and I really took time and like tried to sit still as like much as I could. That's a very challenging thing, but grief looks very differently at different times for people.
The policy thing is so interesting to me because I think so much of, what we end up talking about on these panels, so much of what we talk about when we talk about creating a trauma-informed workplace, we're looking at policy because policy is really kind of scaffolded our workplaces for so long. That's what's creating culture, intentionally or not, is policies. And so many policies, I think about it when I first started my HR career, we kind of box everyone into a corner. This is all you have. This is it. This is the thing. That's all. And there's no flexibility and there's no nuance here, no shades of gray. And almost everything that has anything to do with people is nuanced, has shades of gray, requires flexibility. And I think that movement of, HR professionals, leaders who are finding flexibility in policies and creating that kind of new scaffold, that new system of work where we recognize we all need something a little bit different. We all have that sense of human connection. I love that this is coming up because I think that is really key because it's different for everyone. It ebbs and flows. I've lost I've lost three of my grandparents and I lost one of my grandmas almost 3 years ago. And I would say, primarily, she had a good life. She had a beautiful life. So there was a lot there that was pretty positive. And a couple days ago, I got a new puppy, which is a whole other chaotic conversation. But she was getting into things and she pulled out a card that my grandma had written me. And it said, "It was so lovely to hear your voice. I wish I got to hear your voice more often." And I was like a puddle on the ground. And this was something where I thought, I've worked through this. I don't have any kind of existing emotions or feelings. And okay, here I am, 3 years later, a puddle on the ground. So, a small example, but certainly a poignant one of, hey, It's not linear. It's so different for each of us. It ebbs and flows. Kind of is something that exists with us for our whole lives. In a lot of the same ways traumatic experiences exist for us. They color our experience. They kind of reshape our approach to the world. So I love how this discussion is flowing. I think you all are making excellent points. One of the things that's come up is how can we kind of normalize being able to have conversations about grief? So how can organizations create cultures where people feel more comfortable talking about grief, talking about loss in the workplace, or even asking for those supports?
I think this is such a tough one, right? Because we know that it looks a little bit different for everyone. But normalizing, I want to just normalize the fact that we don't do a great job talking about grief at work, because we don't do a great job at talking about grief in our lives, right? Like, we all tend to shy away from emotions that are maybe a little bit more uncomfortable for us, be it anger, grief, anxiety, whatever it is that just doesn't feel great in your body, like we shy away from. And so if we're not even comfortable doing it with our closest friends and family, then I think expecting someone to be able to do it at work is like a really tall ask. So yes, Alex's point on like managers need training on this stuff, for sure, and like repetition. But if you're a leader listening to this, if you're an HR professional listening to this, I think the number one thing that each of us can do is model it. So if and when we are navigating our own grief, talk about it. If we know someone on our team is navigating grief, ask about it. Like, I very much related to, I forget who said this, but you go through the funeral, the service, what have you. For a couple weeks after that, people are maybe checking in on you. Then it kind of goes quiet. Everyone else's lives go back to normal, except yours. So checking in as a manager, not just right after it happens, but maybe every month for the next 6 months, 12 months. Like, you're never going to remind someone that they lost someone. Like, they already remember. So I think we're afraid to bring it up because we're like, oh, we don't want to upset them. To Morgan's point, sometimes that's exactly what needs to happen. So I think just being gentle and curious and sharing your experience to the extent that you're comfortable with it, the more you do that, the more other people are going to follow suit, particularly if you are in some kind of position of leadership.
Yeah, to piggyback a little bit off Jessica, I love the point of like modeling our own process and sharing up to the point we're comfortable. Well, I would also challenge like to push ourselves, right? Because the point is to be a little uncomfortable and to create that environment of psychological safety. But to piggyback on your point, I firmly believe that it has to start with the leader, right? And so making sure we're doing our own work. I believe that the trauma of a leader becomes a team's culture. And so if we're not dealing with our own trauma, then it's going to show up in the ways that our team members show up on our team and in their work. And so I think, creating space, holding space for them to share or to not share, being curious, but also being emotionally intelligent enough to know when to stop asking questions, being tuned in with our team members is super important, and giving permission for the both and to exist. When I think about my brother in the holiday season, I love holiday. Okay. Stephanie knows when it's December, I'm the Hallmark queen when it comes to Christmas movies. I read the books, all the things. But there's also, I feel sad because I miss my brother and I miss the way our family used to be and how we used to come together and play games. And so being okay with our team members feeling both extremes, feeling the joy and the pain, feeling the excitement and the sorrow, and being able to hold the space. And sometimes that might challenge us because the mirror of what they're experiencing may speak to something deep inside of us we haven't dealt with, but allowing that to show us the work that needs to be done within us, because ultimately that's going to create the culture of our teams.
So much of what both of you said resonates for me. I feel like we need to get to a point where, if we're not there already in certain companies, we're creating space for grief where it's led with leadership, vulnerability, and authentic storytelling. So, when leaders share their own experiences with the loss, it actually gives permission to bring your whole self to work. People feel like, okay, this is okay to talk about. And I think maybe just also remembering, as we talk about policies and other things, as people return to work, the productivity isn't the goal, humanity is, and we've touched on that already. Like, we're trying to build resilient and empathetic workplaces where people can actually feel seen and supported. And I actually, to some of the things that were mentioned about some of these, like, I call them empty chair moments, like birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, where like grief cannot be sort of unexpectedly resurface. Like, I feel like, a manager's role isn't to fix that. We're not looking for that. We're trying to create a safe space where somebody can work through it and just be heard. And that's why, like, the policy is a key, but leading with empathy is what comes first.
Something in hearing all of you talk about this question that comes up for me is that I do think that companies generally, when there's mass shootings or different things like that, we have comms, we can talk, there's grief counselors, like there's so many things outlined. And it's so interesting to me that from an employee perspective, we can't like tap into that same duality of that mind, because a lot of those same resources are needed, you know what I'm saying, for these other relationships, interpersonal things that are going on. But if it is something that happens, maybe not even in our same state, we can all pull together. We have everything so ready. And I always find that a little bit intriguing, because if it's somebody in leadership or it's their position or whatever the case may be, and they're grieving, all of a sudden it's just like nothing. Like, we don't know what to do. We have no idea how to act. And I think we can learn so much from that moment of being able to work with people on comms. We're trying to get a feeling from that and to relay a feeling, right? And so I think we can take some of these tactics that we operate with in like really, chaotic or troublesome moments, and utilize that for interpersonal, relationships, day to day, working with our colleagues, leadership in a way that can be streamlined and understand in those moments. We know people are going to relapse on their grief or whatever the case may be. With that being said, why don't we allow that same flexibility anywhere outside? We don't ask them to take the bereavement days then. All of a sudden, we're super flexible. But it's only in those big moments that I see that. And I think we can really transition and bring that flexibility in-house in our day-to-day actions.
Such an excellent point, because I think it's when it's a shared experience, it's like, oh, we've got to address this. We have to do something, especially over the course of the last 4 or 5 years. I think for HR professionals and leaders, it's like, okay, this thing happened. We have to do something. How do we get ready? How do we respond? And what's interesting, though, is when we already all talked about this quite extensively, grief is a shared experience. It's just something that is going to be different, or we'll be grieving different things at different moments. So I love that different thought process, Morgan. Like, why can't we mobilize to that on this more individual level? And to kind of piggyback on that, thinking about resources, thinking about, tactically, what can we do in the workplace to get better at this? Are there any resources, supports that you're aware of, that either exist or maybe ones you wish existed, that folks can think about leveraging to do better at supporting, the grief experience at work?
I can't fully say the grief experience at work, but something I personally do get if I know that somebody is grieving or going through something like that. There's this book I love, and it's called Grief Day by Day. I love it because it has something literally every day for you, but you don't have to follow it. And in the first passage, it talked about something that I didn't really know how to explain or feel for myself. And basically, it goes into saying that we feel this sadness when people have died. And I think that's the uncomfortable part that Jessica was talking about before, and just trying to reconcile those feelings. And it was basically saying to lean into that and to understand this is just love past their being. And that completely transformed everything. I allowed myself to feel that feeling. And I felt like it was a warm hug for me, because I'm feeling this because this is how much I love somebody. This is love past them. And I think when we can start talking about it in a different way, it's helpful. I think also we have these relapse days, right? And so being able to have that book that has 365 days a year, and goes over different components and everything else, you don't have to read it every day. But if you need to read it, it's there for that specific day for grief. And so for me, that's a personal gift that I give out. If I know that somebody's dealing with something, I think it could be very helpful in work. I know I'm sure you're going to say it, Alex, but Breathe, Empathy, like some of those companies that are out like that, I think those are fabulous as well. But I'll be honest, I'm still learning too. Like this is still a very recent thing for me, and trying to figure out, especially with my compliance hat in HR, like how do we fit this in without managers saying just use FMLA? Like that's not the moment or the feeling I'm trying to give somebody. Yes, you are giving them time off, but it's unpaid, and they're probably having a financial burden and trying to plan a funeral and all these other things. Like, where's the in between? And I think that's something personally I'm still struggling with. Not to say that I fully understand everything the business is doing, but understand some of the components that they're saying of like, how do we make sure it's fair? How do we make sure it's equitable? Like, what does that look like? And I'm personally challenged sometimes myself. And so I'd love to hear what some of the things other people are saying, because it's a day-by-day thing and a person-by-person thing for me.
Yeah, Morgan, I can't wait to get that book because I need to get it. But also just like having access for the team members for therapy or mental health services, that was huge for me. Being able to like have access, not worrying about like if it's covered by insurance or not, but there were specific therapists that were connected to the company that I didn't have to tell anyone. I could contact them, set up time, and just talk through. And I think we had a certain amount of sessions that we could do that was free. And then beyond that, we would have to pay. But that was like a game changer for me because it's really hard sometimes. Like the added stress of finding a therapist can be really hard. And so being able to do that would I think would be really, really helpful. And then if you do have to take FMLA, I will say simplifying that process, because at one point I did take a leave, but the added stress that comes along with all the things you have to do in order to take the time that you need made it even more stressful. Yeah. And so I would say that's something that I would love for organizations to work toward, is like simplifying that process, because it's not helpful to add that on top of the grief someone's already dealing with.
Yeah.
I want to give my quick PSA about FMLA right now. Sorry, Alex. Okay. I have this is something I have been telling HR leaders as long as I've been doing HR and FMLA. My first role, I did employee relations and basically was like the FMLA paperwork lady. When you're processing FMLA, when you're familiar with FMLA, you get really kind of processy around it. It becomes part of your day-to-day. And someone who's taking FMLA for whatever reason is experiencing something that is a major life moment. And especially when it's something that is an unexpected use of FMLA, they need all the empathy, love, care, and explanation. So you really have to pull yourself out of this daily process I do and get into, like we've been talking about, that human moment. I think that is one thing that anyone who touches FMLA, if they change that today, it would make workplaces so much better. So whenever I have a chance to say that, I always get on my soapbox. So thank you for letting me interrupt you, Alex, to do that.
That's okay. No, that's fine. So I think, Morgan knew I was going to bring up places like Bereave, because I do think grief training is something that is sorely missed. And whether I continue in a fractional capacity or go back in-house at some point in my career, it's something that I will drum the beat on, so to speak. Because honestly, when I was going through it, as I'm sure for other people, and I preface this by saying I'm not holding this against anyone, but I either got, nothing from nobody because they didn't know what to say, right? And I think they could have, with education and training, they could have been armed with at least the basics. And then I had somebody who said to me when I told them that my mother had a terminal diagnosis, I hope that goes well, which it wasn't, because she was going to pass away. And so, but they, again, I think this person might have been a little bit sort of just generally socially awkward anyway, and just didn't know what to say in the moment. So I think training and education can go a long way for people. I've also probably not unlike others, have invested in looking at other resources for myself. One that I like I use for practical guidance is, and I kind of got turned on by the name initially, but it was actually really useful, was It's Okay That You're Not Okay, which challenges traditional grief narratives. And then a podcast that I've just started getting into, again, kind of like the name to start off with, was Terrible, Thanks for Asking. And it captures how grief sort of shapes our professional identities while maintaining humanity and even humor, which I know it's weird to say humor and grief in the same breath, but it can exist as well.
That's is that Nora McInerney's podcast?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. I love her. Yeah. She wrote a book called The Hot Young Widows Club. That's what I always think of when I like how she speaks and her words and everything. But another thing that I was just kind of thinking to add in terms of like practical things, what can we do? I think it's clear here what we're saying is like manager training and managers nurturing their one-on-one relationships with each of their direct reports. Like that is table stakes and probably the biggest thing that is missing in workplaces today. Because at the end of the day, like a great bereavement policy isn't necessarily going to negate a manager who said something offensive or that upset someone or made them feel like a number or made them feel like no one cared about them. So manager training for sure. I also think just like we touched a little bit on this, but like timeline, right? So if we know someone's dealing with a lot of anticipatory grief, that's something to be thinking about before there's even a funeral service or something like that. Also checking in after. I think it can be like a really nice touch to acknowledge like the anniversary of the death of a loved one for someone. If you have, supported them through that in the past, like acknowledging maybe another day off on the anniversary, or even just like a kind message saying, I'm thinking of you. I know today is going to be hard. If, you want to take it a little easier, camera off, like we're A-okay with that. Totally understand. Just little things like that acknowledge that they are not going to be the grief is not going to be worked through in 2 weeks. It's not going to be worked through in a month. It's not going to be worked through in a year. Like this is going to be a forever thing. Just being sensitive to the fact and acknowledging that that, I think goes a lot longer than a lot of managers realize. Like no one's looking for you to say the perfect thing because you can't fix it. Like you can't bring that person back. So I think if you're a leader, like taking some of that pressure off yourself to know the right thing to say, there isn't, checking in on someone, letting them know you care, letting them know you're thinking about them. Like these are very small things that make a massive difference. That's how you build that relationship between a manager and employee. And that's just thousands of touch points over time accumulate into, this trusting relationship where your team will feel more comfortable talking to you about some of this stuff.
And Jessica, can I add to what you just said? Like all of what you said is very true. And it's also true if you have a peer going through something, right? Like not only is it important to create that relationship between manager and team member and vice versa, but even our colleagues, checking in on them when something happens, that can like mean the world to somebody, because it's easy to isolate someone just because you don't know what to say. And so even just saying, hey, I see you, right? If you need anything, or thinking about like, is there something I could take off their plate? You know what I mean? But also don't offer to take off something off somebody's plate if you're not actually going to do it. Or don't say, let me know if you need something. If when they tell you they need something, you're not going to help. So also being aware of that, but just just, highlighting that colleague relationship too is also important. And we can just check in on each other and help each other through hard times.
Yeah.
I love what you said, Jessica. Like, I honestly, I don't even know how I forgot about this moment, but when I first moved to New York in 2016, it was my grandmother's birthday. I was so excited. Just moved here, just started a job. She passed on her birthday. It was my very first day. And I was going through training. I found out via text. And the first time I met my manager, like actually working for her, not interviewing, I was terrified because I was just like, how do I tell this woman my grandmother just died? I am very sad. Like, is she going to believe me? I know we all know HR, like a lot of people quit. Something wasn't happening, right? Like, is she going to believe me? I'm originally from Texas. I'm going to have to fly back. I don't know what that's going to look like. And I just started this job. I wasn't eligible for FMLA. You know what I'm saying? I wasn't eligible for a lot of things. So it was my first day. And that's a very tough conversation to have. But her just saying, hey, I trust you. I'm allowing you to do that and like do what you need to do. It meant the world to me because that was a very hard conversation to have. And that's something I often think about too. And like I come back to of like, it was a very hard day. It was supposed to be a very exciting day. It was her birthday at that, so I was so excited, but now I'm grieving and dealing with the loss on her birthday. And now I'm trying to tell people that I just started this job with in a new city, incredibly isolating, you know what I'm saying? And dealing with all of these compounding emotions, but having that from a peer level, having that from a manager level, having that from familial, like it's all of those little touch points that truly make a difference. And I can only imagine what she thought, of me just starting and everything else. But like talk about feeling secure and safe with somebody. It was after I said that. Took everything for me to say it. But after I said that, it opened up so many things to where it's like, I know I can trust you. Like I know I can literally trust you in ways that I can't even magnify right now, just because that kind gesture when she could have said no, like you don't have that yet. You literally have not even worked here for 24 hours.
All of you are like making me think of so many other things as well as you're talking. Like a couple of them are just as we talk about flexibility, particularly for companies that want to be more thoughtful about this, is like, is kind of doing more of a phased return to work options with like different schedules and workloads for people coming back from bereavement. Like we're able to do it for other forms of leave, so why can't we do it for bereavement? And then also even thinking about doing more of a modified performance review process that accounts for grief periods, right? Something like that as well is just, I think, what some forward-thinking companies could be thinking about as well. I also think that like for me, even like having flexibility, and I give kudos to my last company that when I did know that my mother had a timeline and was in another country and I wanted to spend as much time with her as possible, I asked, and you don't ask, you don't get, that like I needed to start working from the UK 1 week a month to spend as much time as possible. And they allowed that to happen. Eventually I needed to go on a sabbatical and I recognize that's a privilege that I have. Not everyone can take that, but I just needed to do that. But I appreciated that I was able to make an ask and it was accommodated at the same time. And just people being open and flexible with that. And going back to the grief training, I think also for people that are doing that training, like taking it and haven't been through it, it could be a really full circle moment for when sadly they will have to go through grief and be so thankful that the people around them, including themselves, have gone through that grief training too.
Obviously we know supporting people through grief, through traumatic experience, through the hard times in life at work is the right thing to do. But Morgan, Alex, you both just gave these examples of how in doing the right thing, what an amazing sense of loyalty, of trust your leaders, that created, and then that benefit that goes along with it. So obviously it's just the right thing to do, but there are real legitimate business benefits to doing the right thing. We love when that happens. And I will like plus 100 on Bereave. Such a phenomenal organization, such great resources. So absolutely, if you're not familiar, highly recommend checking them out. And I do want to shameless plug for, the work I do. It can be a lot when we think about managers how can I approach and how can I have the right conversations? Alex, I agree. Specific grief training is, again, it's table stakes. But also when we think about if we get leaders the tools and resources to be trauma informed, those also support how we can better navigate conversations and supports around grief as well. So have to add that plug in here since, I'm all about trauma informed workplaces. I really do think those trauma informed principles help us navigating grief as well.
Hey, Stephanie,
Can
I
yeah, please.
you just made me think of mental health first aid,
Yeah.
and how helpful that could be, because when you think about grief, like sometimes we're not just dealing with grief. There's so many other emotions that are attached to the grief. It could be joy, but it could be sorrow. It could be like all these things. And so it's not just one thing. And so I think even mental health first aid training could be helpful for organizations and leaders as we think about all like the fullness of the emotion and all that comes along with it, and how do you navigate that for yourself, but also for those you're leading.
Absolutely. Great recommendation. Love that.
And Stephanie, you also said something that resonated with me, which is we talk so much about retention of employees and like supporting them through the tough times, and we generally talk about things, and not to like undermine their importance, but like somebody not getting a salary increase and how are we going to keep them and things like that. There is probably no harder thing, or very few harder things to navigate that is hard while you're working than grief. And so if you are able to do the right thing by somebody, they will stick by you. If you just think from a pure loyalty, because it speaks volumes to your character as an organization as well. I mean, we talk about values, but like that is really lived values if you're able to do something like that.
Absolutely.
It speaks to your character, just to add on to what Alex is saying, it speaks to your character for sure as a leader to do the right thing. But I also think there's like something just under the surface that like, I think we as HR people feel it, employees feel it. Don't know if the C-suite knows it's there, but I feel like our teams are they're always scanning to get a read on like, do you see me as a human being? Or do you see me as someone that earns you your bonus at the end of the year?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, demonstrating this compassion, emotional intelligence, whatever you want to call it, like I think that sends a very strong message to not just the employee dealing with grief, but everyone around them who sees how the company treated them when they were dealing with that grief. I think it sends a big message about how much this company values its people. And these are like approving or denying someone's bereavement leave is just like one other thing that might happen in a day at a company. But like me losing my partner was like an earth-shattering thing in my life. So when you compare the two, right? Like, are we going to have this marketing report in on time? Like, you don't care when you just lost your person, right? Like you can't hold people to a standard of full performance and operating as usual when their brain is like gone through, a meat grinder or something. So I think just, again, like the more we can show that we see you as human beings, we don't just see you as like worker bees, like that's the key to all of this.
Yeah. And Jessica, I would just add to that, like plus 100, because by the time I ended up leaving my last company, I went from even bothering, with saying the I'm fine to just in my head thinking, God, this is so trivial. Like, I don't have time mentally to like deal with what seems like such an asinine ask, because I'm dealing and I don't have the mental capacity and space with everything else that I'm contending with. So I completely hear what you're saying there.
Absolutely. Well, I can't believe it. We're almost out of time. These conversations always go too quickly. Mm-hmm. Thank you all so much for all of your insights and for your vulnerability and leading this conversation and helping normalize conversations around grief and loss at work. I would love to wrap up with one final question. And for our folks listening in who'd like to learn more, if they'd like some additional resources, I know we've actually had a few that got thrown out during the discussion, which is amazing. But if you have anything you'd like to share or recommend for our listeners as a takeaway to go and learn more, Alex, I'll start with you.
Yeah, to your point, I've shared a few, but the only ones I would probably add to what I've not said already is obviously I'm a big fan of Adam Grant, and I think he writes beautifully in general on grief. And then the other one that I have also come across that I think provides excellent resources for managers, employees is called actually the Grief at Work Toolkit, and it's from a nonprofit called The Dinner Party. So I would say if you're looking for something that has tangible takeaways and resources, that's a really useful one.
Amazing. Thank you. Jessica.
Yeah, so my recommendation, it's a book. It's not tailored to the workplace. It's more kind of an exploration of grief in general. It's written by someone who is a hospital chaplain, so very familiar with grief. It's called As Long as You Need, which the title just gets me right in my heart space, because when you think about grief, like that's what people need, the permission to take as long as they need to like feel all the feels. So if you're just in general like interested in the experience of grief globally and what that can look like for all kinds of people that, you know, this author has worked with, it's a really good one.
Thank you. Morgan.
I mentioned the book already, Grief Day by Day. You can find it pretty much anywhere. The other thing I would say, I don't think we touched on too much, but don't forget EAP. It's something your employer is likely already paying for. They have financial planning. Some of them have funeral planning and assets that can kind of help you get things together, either before, you know, the anticipated death, if there's one, or after. And so just don't forget the things that your company is already paying into, because they may have services that can take some things literally right off of your hands with you without you having to do anything. It's just something I always like to highlight.
Amazing. Yes, great add on to EAP. Geraldine.
Yeah, there's been some really great resources multiple times shared here. I want to take a little bit of a different direction, and I just want to encourage folks to create space because a lot of what we're seeking can be found in here. And so I would encourage you to journal. And I know some people are journalers and some are not. I am for sure a journaler, but sometimes journaling can tap into our subconscious and really help us to dig into places where we don't even know. And so when we allow ourselves to begin to heal, right, we can help others heal, including our team members. And so journaling, I would highly suggest. And from there, finding other people who can help you process that, a therapist, support groups. You know, I love the Dinner Party group. They have a lot of good resources, but first figuring out what is at the root so that you can really uncover and have productive processing happen.
Amazing. Great recommendations. Thank you all so much. This was such a wonderful conversation. I so appreciate you making the time. Everyone, thank you so much for listening in. And until next time, be well.